Welcome tankers to episode 2 of my series Basics on Blitz. In this series of videos I will try to highlight some of the key elements in the game so that you may better understand how the game works and that way be able to perform more efficiently and ultimately win more battles. In episode 1 I covered view range, concealment and spotting mechanics, and in this episode I will cover ammunition types, their functionality and interaction with game elements. I will not be going in depth with penetration and damage dealing mechanics, as this builds upon the underlying ammunition functionalities, but I will of course cover this topic in a later video. In World of Tanks Blitz there are 4 types of ammunition: armor piercing AP, armor piercing composite rigid APCR, high explosive anti-tank heat, and high explosive HE. First of all, I need to cover velocity. Velocity is mainly a factor when you're shooting at a distance and trying to figure out how much to lead your target. And in general terms, APCR is the fastest shell, followed by AP, and the slowest shells are heat and HE. Velocity do vary a lot from tank to tank, and if you want to know the velocity of shells on specific tanks, I encourage you to look this up on external web pages, for instance like blitzstars.com. In this example you see here a variation from AP, APCR to heat and HE velocity on 2 tier 8 tanks. This may not seem as a big difference, but as you progress towards higher tiers there will be significantly larger variations from tank to tank, as you will see in this comparison between the WC121 and the Leopard 1, both with AP ammunition. And then I'll go into the specifics on AP and APCR. AP and APCR shells, they both work on kinetic energy, and the shell itself has to penetrate the armor in order to deal damage to the target. This is why these shells generally have a higher velocity than the other shells. Both AP and APCR can ricochet, so if an angle of impact is 70 degrees or higher, the shell will ricochet. It will only happen on tanks, not on buildings, on the ground, or anywhere else. Another factor to notice with regards to AP and APCR is normalization. Normalization is the ability of a shell to shift its angle to be less than the impact angle when it's hitting a target. For AP the normalization is 5 degrees and for APCR it's 2 degrees. In this example we have an armor plate with a thickness of 100 millimeters. Due to the angle of 60 degrees, the relative thickness is 200 millimeters. If we shoot that armor with an AP shell, the normalization factor will shift the AP shell impact angle to be only 55 degrees, and thereby making the relative armor thickness less, and we may penetrate the armor. I will go much more into depth with this detail in a later video. The last factor regarding AP and APCR is penetration drop-off. Since both AP and APCR works on kinetic energy and lose velocity over distance, they also they penetrate less armor along the distance. So penetration drop-off is not that important in Blitz due to the relative small maps we have and many close encounters. But especially if you're playing in the support role with a soft armor TD, for instance, sniping across the map, this is something you could be aware of. Penetration drop-off is only a factor when you're shooting at targets at more than 100 meters, and from 100 meters to 500 meters penetration drop-off is linear, and after 500 it remains the same. And if you want to look deeper into this, go to blitzhanger.com and look up specific tanks, and there you can see the percentage of the drop-off. Next are the heat and the HE shells. So there's a lot of similarities between these shells. Both shells will detonate on impact with any object they hit in the game. They do not normalize, they cannot ricochet, and they don't lose penetration over distance, but they retain their armor penetrating capabilities all the way to max distance. Heat works by creating a shape-charged explosion when it hits a target, and the HE explodes and sends shrapnel in all directions when it hits a target, damaging whatever they may hit. So penetrating values on HE are generally much lower than all the other ammunition types, but there are a number of tanks, especially British tanks, which have a special HE called High Explosive Squash Head, or HESH. And HESH is basically just a higher penetrating HE round, which besides all the better penetrating values act similar to normal HE round. Some German and European tanks also carry a form of HESH, like the Standard B for instance. There's one ability of the HE ammunition to take notice of, and that is the blast radius. Blast radius is in my opinion a very overlooked stat in Blitz, and it is the radius of an HE shell where it will send a shrapnel out and potentially deal damage. The in-game tooltips show this, but only in some rounded numbers. So if you want to know the exact numbers, look up on Blitzhanger. And then I'll go in to some examples where I'll show some of these shells and how they work with some elements in game. The first video here, if you remember the last video I put out with the spotting mechanics, there's Tiger 2 behind the wall, but because it's covered totally behind the wall, then I'll only proximity spot it once my distance drop below 50 meters. If you want to know more about this, look into my last video with spotting mechanics, for instance, and view range. So I have AP and APCR and HE on this tank, and you see that AP go easily through the wall there and breaks the wall and then damages the tank. And of course the same with the APCR. Those are both shells that works on kinetic energy, so they don't break when they hit the wall. The HE round does explode when they hit the wall and don't damage the tank. And here you have another tank, that's the T-34-2 with AP. Of course it goes through. If you load heat with that, with the directional explosion, it will hit come in contact with the wall, and then it will detonate, but it will not be a high enough detonation to actually damage the tank. And then lastly, of course, the HE as well. It detonates upon contact with the wall, and it most likely won't damage the tank at all. Another example here is if you're frontally, for instance, against a highly armored tank here, you see that I cannot pen it with the normal shells, so I switch to heat. And you can easily pen the lower plate of the Tiger 2 here with heat shell. But if you look at those crates or boxes on the right side of the tank there, the Tiger 2, when he backs up behind those while I'm reloading, and I go out again, and I know I could pen him easily on the lower plate with heat. So once I go out there, you can see that with a heat shell, I can easily pen him. But if I shoot him through the boxes, it detonates upon contact with the boxes and doesn't even touch the tank. If you go with APCR instead, the APCR and the T-44 have a little bit less penetrating values than the heat on the F-34-2, and you see that it's kind of pinkish down below there on the Tiger 2, and that means that it barely can penetrate it. So I know I can penetrate the lower bottom. I know that APCR goes through boxes and walls and stuff, but due to the fact that every item that is breakable in the game will take away 25 millimeters of pen of your rounds, AP and APCR, it loses 25 millimeters. You can actually see the mark where it hits the armor there, and it doesn't go through because it loses 25 millimeters of pen. So that is something to take into account when driving on these stages or these maps, because a lot of people, they just tend to break these boxes and stuff. Another example here of resetting a cap. You see the Tiger 2, I can't really pen him anywhere, but just switching to HE, you can see that it turns kind of yellowish, and I can just splash damage him on the side, and it resets the cap and deals a little bit of damage. And another example here is if you cannot drive out in front of it, for instance, if you're very low health and you have some teammates, you're just waiting for them, but you need to reset the cap, you don't even actually have to see the tank. You can just splash the ground next to the tank with some HE, and that will damage the tracks or maybe even the tank. So you don't have to cause HP damage to the tank, just some kind of damage to it where the track crit is damaged, and that will reset the cap in this situation here. Another situation that people they tend to encounter is either they don't run premium ammo, or in this case here they run out of premium ammo, and then they can't hit the target, or they can't penetrate the target. So what can you do here if you can't get around him? You can always shoot HE underneath the tank. You can also, for instance here, if you go for the hatch, because most tanks have some weak spots, but every tank has a very soft bottom, or the underneath of the tank are very soft. So if you just strike the ground underneath a tank with HE ammunition, due to the splash damage and the blast radius, it will damage the tank. Not for much, but it will still damage the tank here. And you saw in the previous clip, or a few clips back, that the T-44 had a blast radius of 1.75 meters-ish. And if I hit the wall next to it, it's not a big enough blast radius to actually damage the tank for HP, but enough to just damage its tracks. You see it's yellow, or it turned yellow on the front there. And that's because I could actually shoot HE in the front, but it wouldn't have damage for much. Where 145 underneath the tank is quite okay, I think, for an HE splash damage. The blast radius on the T-34-2 was 2.5 meters almost. And also a higher damaging shell. So if I shoot this shell on the side here on the wall, it actually damages the tank a little bit, but not much, but it's a little bit. And lastly here, with the same blast radius, the same reset situation or scenario here, again, you don't even have to see the tank, just splash the ground next to it, and it'll cause some kind of damage to the capping tank, and you can reset the cap this way. So that was a lot of information. So I will shortly sum it up for you. Remember that the largest difference is between the solid shells and the exploding shells. So AP and APCR, they can both ricochet when they hit armor at an angle of 70 degrees or more. They can pass through breakable objects on the map, but they all lose 25 millimeters of pen for each object that they pass through. Both shells, they will normalize, AP with 5 degrees and APCR with 2 degrees, and I will cover that more in a later video. Maybe a little bit too complex for a short video like this. And then finally, both shells will start lose some penetration values after 100 meters. The penetration drop off. The heat and HE shells, they don't have penetration drop off. They cannot ricochet on anything. They don't gain any normalization bonus when they're shooting at angled armor. And also remember that they detonate on impact, so they cannot pass through items. So whatever you're shooting at, they'll just detonate. And lastly, then pay note to the blast radius of HE ammunition. It may be a little bit nerdy, but you can always try to exploit the potential to your advantage. So that's all for now. I hope you enjoyed the video, maybe learned something new. Please give me a like if you enjoyed it, and consider to subscribe if you want to see more from me. And please feel free to leave a comment down below if you have any thoughts or ideas, or if there's something you want me to dive into in coming videos. Other than that, take care and happy tanking.